You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
You're listening to Fantha Tracks. Flip through the galaxy of literature. Welcome to Canon Fodder.
Fantha Tracks were fortunate enough to catch up with Zoraida Córdova, author of the upcoming The High Republic Phase 2 novel, Convergence, as well as the Galaxy Edge young adult novel, A Crash of Fate, as well as the short stories You Owe Me a Ride, from the New Hope edition of From a Certain Point of View, and The Lost Night Sister from 2020's The Clone Wars Stories of Light and Dark. We discuss the High Republic, Galaxy's Edge and much, much more as we welcome Zoraida as our latest interview guest here on Canon Fodder.
Zoraida, welcome to Fantha Tracks. Welcome to Canon Fodder. This is podcasting. I don't know why I'm doing this, but I'm showing the book. You've got a lovely new book out called Convergence. To kick off our conversation, entering the High Republic, being a part of this ongoing now storyline that has done this really cool George Lucas type thing of doing a set of stories and then going back to tell more stories that sort of underpin what we know. How interesting was it for you to come into this sort of scenario and join an existing bunch of writers and have the chance to create something yourself that's new?
Yeah, it was very exciting to be able to join the initiative when the original, the Fab Five of the High Republic, when that was announced, it was just such an interesting process and endeavor. And when I got invited to join for phase 2, it was intimidating at first because I'm such a huge fan of all the authors and a lot of them are my friends. And I think now we're all friends. But it was a very, very cool thing to join in and see how not only had they expanded the Star Wars universe, but they'd expanded the storylines of the different phases that we're going to see.
And when you knew you were going to be a part of it, was there an element of this that you thought, oh, I quite fancy digging into that side of this era of the Star Wars galaxy? Or indeed, did you know that the storyline was going to go back the chunk of time that it did? Was that news to you when you were brought in?
That was news to me. I got an email from our fearless leader, Mike Siglain, or I got a message from him being like, have you checked your email? And I was like, no, should I? Because I avoid my email like the plague. And so that was invitation. In that, it sort of explained like what they were doing, that they were going to go back in time, very much in that George Lucas tradition of being like, all right, let's pause here and let's rewind so that we can see where it all started. I knew that I was going to write the adult novel, number one, from Del Rey. And then I got the rundown of, okay, this is what the story is. And then I had to give my own pitch of what I would do and which characters I would focus on.
So when you knew it was going back, which is sort of what George did in a way, what were you excited by that? Because you're coming in on the ground floor again, aren't you? You've got the chance to be a part of establishing the characters of this era of the High Republic. Was that quite exciting?
Yeah, that was really exciting. And once I knew, was fascinated by figuring out basically who I would want to focus on, because the characters from phase 1 are so beloved by the High Republic book fandom. And now we have the challenge of saying like, okay, well, we have to create new characters for people to love and see maybe perhaps the backstory of some characters who are literally just legends in phase 1, like the Blade of Bardata himself, right? So that was pretty fascinating.
Because these stories all tie in so carefully, and it's not just adult novels, it's not just young readers stuff, it's comics as well. So there's all these, it's a mega lattice of storylines that come together. When you're, I don't know the right way to phrase it, allocated, I don't know, allotted a story or given a certain story to do, obviously Michael Siglain picked you because he knows that sort of storytelling is what you do and it's in your wheelhouse. How much latitude then do you have? Is it a lightly sketched 3-paragraph thing? Is it quite a detailed document? Where do you pick it up and then run with it from?
I mean, it's a very big document. It's a very secret document too. But I've sort of had experience with that. My first Star Wars book was a young adult novel called A Crash of Fate, which was a tie-in to Galaxy's Edge Batu.
Yeah.
And so I was sort of familiar with like being given all of this information and then sort of finding like, all right, this is the place where I want to tell this story. And so it all sort of centers around a time period where the galaxy is still finding itself, right? Like we have two chancellors and the Jedi are not working with the Republic in the way that we've seen them during the Clone Wars time period. And so we've only seen a very specific type of Jedi. We're introduced to the Jedi with Luke Skywalker, like in a time period where the Jedi have fallen. And so now we're going back to a time period where the Jedi are at the height of glory is not the right word because it's not a very Jedi word, but it is. It's like the glory of the Jedi and they're out there traveling and it's the Wild West, the American Wild West, right? Looking for new frontiers, expanding and charting the hyperspace lanes. And so we don't have a big bad in the sense of like a Darth Vader type of big bad, right? Or like a Palpatine. It's more of like there's war going on. There's flux in these outer rim territories. And it feels like the Jedi still have a lot to fight for because they're fighting for the peace across the galaxy. And this is their mission. And there's somebody trying to stop their mission. And so for me, looking at this blanket of like, oh, wow, there's a lot happening here, I wanted to focus on the two planets, Aram and Arano, which we see them named in phase 1. And I think Cavan Scott's book opens up in Aram, or either that one or the last one. They open up on Aram. But now we get to see we're on the ground. We have boots on the ground. That's sort of where I saw that. I see two planets at war, immediately. I'm like, okay, well, how are we going to resolve this? And so my pitch is like, a page of like, this is what I would do. So here's my summary of what I would do. So and then I'm sort of told like what I'm allowed to do and what I'm not.
Okay. So when you get a situation like that, whereby, as you described, the old Buffy phrase, isn't it? There isn't a big bad, a specific big bad. Do you like that? Because I guess as a writer, it gives you the opportunity then to do a bit of world building on these planets, a bit of character building with the personalities you've got in the storyline, rather than generally if there's like you say, a big bad, then that's the focus of everybody's efforts. This feels like it's a more defining an era almost.
It's defining an era, and the evil is not like we're learning what the conflict is, right, all together. And, it's not just here's Palpatine, here's Snoke. It's sort of like the forces, and I hate, like no pun intended, that the Jedi are going to have to face.
Yeah.
And so there's like a lot of excellent conflict. We're all figuring this out together. And so it is defining its own time period in the galaxy, not just because of what the Jedi have to face, but because we're seeing the galaxy sort of get built, and we're seeing characters that from phase 1. I don't have them in my book, but in Lydia's book, we've already revealed that Yaddle is going to be there, right? So we get to see these characters hundreds of years before.
This is Adam Christopher, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
One of the curious things that I find fascinating about this era specifically is because it's in that 1,000-year gap when the Sith weren't prevalent and Qui-Gon's the first guy to really have any kind of encounter with the Sith to the knowledge of everybody else. That's a set of characters, if you like, an adversary that you can't necessarily pull in quite so overtly as you might do if you were doing a story that was set, between Empire and Jedi or another era, let's say. Do you find that interesting in that you've got to make your big bads on the level of your storytelling as it goes, different kind of enemy, a different kind of adversary? They can't just flash out a red lightsaber and go for it.
Yeah. And I think as in my book specifically, and of course, we have excellent villains in this time period, but in my book specifically, for me, I wanted to play with how does a villain or an adversary have influence from the shadows? Like, how does somebody move things when they're not necessarily in the same planet, or perhaps like they're sort of like a puppet master pulling the strings? And so what does it look like? How do you have that kind of influence? And that in itself is actually pretty terrifying, because it's sort of this like faceless entity that you're fighting. You don't know who you're fighting. You don't know why this bad thing is happening. And so Convergence specifically is about two planets at war, and we open at a ceasefire. And from there, it's sort of like dominoes. Once, of course, these fires are broken, they either last into peace or they're broken and we go back to fighting. And so it's not a spoiler to say that they go back to fighting and they have to figure out how to make peace stay. And so the conflict in this book is making sure these two planets who are become a sort of a symbol of peace across the galaxy. If the Jedi can fix what's going on in this region and the Republic can show that they can bring peace to the Outer Rim and these wild spaces, because Aram and Arano can do it, maybe the rest of the galaxy can as well. And so that becomes a symbol on its own. And I feel like in our very real world, countries are symbols. Like the United States was a symbol for so long of very specific ideals. And not to talk about what happened or didn't happen, but when you translated that into fiction, even we see like certain planets uphold a very specific kind of symbolism to us.
When The Phantom Menace came out and there was that conversation at the breakfast table where Shmi basically says the Republic doesn't exist out here. That was quite a telling line in that film. And here we are in an era now, we've had the High Republic phase 1, now we've stepped back for phase 2. And the MO is for the Republic to get out into the Outer Rim and do, like you said, braving the wild frontier kind of thing. As a reader, it's going to be fascinating, I think, to see how the Republic tries to strike out, but at some point there's a fracture that means that the Outer Rim becomes almost isolated as it is in the prequel trilogy. As you're developing what you write, and Siglain and the team and everybody else is developing the broader story, how conscious are you of, even though it's, where are we now, 250 years before the prequels, it's a good chunk away, isn't it? Maybe even further than that. How conscious are you that
300 and something years? Don't quote me.
it's a good way away, but it feels like that kind of thought process is on the horizon. How does that work when you're breaking these things down?
Well, it's easy to forget what is common knowledge in the eras, and so like sometimes I would have used like a very specific species and they're like, well, we can't use that species yet because we haven't met them until XYZ. And so that stuff has actually been really, really fun because it's all the nerdy Star Wars stuff. I was really surprised at like the length of time that a spaceship in the Star Wars universe can last and can really hold up for, because it's not like, you're trading in your sedan every couple years or every few years, right, for a new one. There are some ships that have been lasting for like the Halcyon, right? And so that's pretty cool. But also seeing how the Republic is now going to work with two chancellors, right? It's something that we haven't seen in the other eras before. And I was really fascinated by the idea of like, how do these chancellors' relationships work? Lydia Kang and I, who is writing Cataclysm, the book after Convergence, we were furiously texting each other during our deadlines, like trying to match up our storylines and sort of, you're going to see there are two chancellors. There's Chancellor Orlan Malo and there's a Chancellor Kyong Greylark. Kyong is very much like a Mon Mothma type of politician where her family has been leaders and chancellors and senators and et cetera, et cetera. So she comes from this like political royal family, like the Kennedys. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And she leads from Coruscant, and the other chancellor sort of travels through the galaxy, and he's sort of like the boots on the ground type of chancellor where he doesn't mind getting his hands dirty. He doesn't come from a political background, but he definitely wants to lead and put his mark on the galaxy. And it's really important for him to broker this peace on Aram and Arano. And so writing him was a very fun part of focusing in on this writing process for Convergence.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds, bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
When you're working up a character, is there sort of somebody you're thinking, this guy's a bit of Obama about him, or this guy's got a bit of this about him? Is there somebody that, you're just saying Kennedy made me think?
Sometimes I think about the inspiration of specific characters. When I was writing Kyong Greylark, I actually thought about the president from The Expanse, the president of Earth. And so this sort of like strong woman who's almost really emotionally hard and puts like duty first over her family. And that's sort of what I thought about when I was writing how Kyong Greylark affects her son Axel Greylark, who is one of the four main characters of this book. And he's a point of view character. For Orlin, I imagine this like nervous politician, and there's like a plethora of, New York nervous politicians out there. So it's, it's easy for us to assume what politicians are like. But for him, no one specific. Ziri Albaran, who is the princess and captain of Arano's fleet. Arano is a desert planet, an arid mountainous desert planet. She was heavily inspired by Princess Leia. I've always wanted to write a fierce warrior princess who can lead her people and is also trying to find a way to break the cycle of war that has been her, basically like her inheritance.
Axel Greylock is one of the coolest names for a character that I remember hearing in ages. And I'm making assumptions that. Did you come up with that name?
Yeah, I did.
It's a cool name. Where did that come from?
Thank you. I came up with the last name first. I have a notebook where I keep, our listeners can't see this, but I keep a notebook.
Yeah.
There's my Kylo.
Nice.
And some High Republic stickers. But so I keep a notebook and I just write down personality traits that I want. And then I just start writing down names. And I don't know why I wrote down the word gray, but then I started writing other words. And then so I had a different A name picked out, which was sort of like a made up name. But I think we decided it was too Tolkien. And I was like, okay, no, he sounds like he belongs like in Riverdale or whatever instead, or like the green, wherever Legolas is from. And then I was to Star Wars it up. I like put an X there. And then then the name just sort of came out after that. That's really like, for me, it's trial and error. And I need to see the name. I need to write it and see if it feels right. And then I say it and I write descriptive paragraph. And then if it feels right, then I'll go with it. And so I presented that name because we changed it a few times. Yeah, because originally I kept calling him Chancellor's son in the outline as a placeholder. And when it came to, I was like, all right, well, now I have to write. So I have to name him. He's the last one to get a name.
Oh, well, it was a great name. Definitely a great name. When you're sort of sketching these characters out and then you start to transfer them into the storyline, how much pleasure do you get, especially for a character like Axel, for example, pick him as an example, of bringing the characters into the story and taking them forward? Do you get a lot of joy out of that?
I do. And I know it's a frustrating thing for anyone who works with me on the editorial side, because I'll present an outline. And then as I'm writing and getting to know the characters through their dialogue and through XYZ, then it'll be like, well, what if they do this instead? And so I just completely veer off. For me, writing, I make a map of what I want the story to be. When you're writing license work, like intellectual property, IP, you have to give the people you're writing for an outline. And sometimes you veer away from that outline. And, that's just the writing process. And I think everyone understands that. But with Axel, I kept veering in these different directions because he was a lot of fun to write, especially characters who don't like to follow rules, right? Like he's basically, I created him to antagonize the Jedi, like Gela, so that their personalities would clash, since the two of them are tasked with protecting the two royal heirs. And so you put the four of them on like the sail barge and tell them to like basically do like, what Kate and William do is like go visit these places. And so they go from city to city, all four of them. And so, I basically was like, well, how do I create more conflict? These personalities are really good. The four of them are really going to have to like clash. That was a whole lot of fun for me.
You mentioned obviously Crash of Fate as your sort of entry point into writing Star Wars, certainly in book form. Well, that's another question before I get to that. Did you, as a younger writer, ever write your own fanfic Star Wars stuff? Was that something that you did?
No, I actually never wrote fan fiction. I didn't even know how huge fan fiction was. I think that I feel like our debut novels are echo books And what I mean by that is like my very first novel was an echo to everything I ever loved, right? And so I wouldn't call it fan fiction, but I do think we derive inspiration from certain things. And so maybe everything is fan fiction because like we're watching Star Wars and that inspires sci-fi writer to go write their own intergalactic space adventure. So is that not Star Wars fan fiction? So, that's a whole other conversation. But no, I didn't write fanfic when I was a kid.
This is Susanna Malik from Mandalorian and Boba Fett, and this is Fantha Tracks. Is it Fantha Track? I'm blind. I couldn't read it. Fantha.
I'm still going to use that.
Are you? Then use it. Even like this dumb broad can't speak English.
When you came into doing Crash of Fate, as we said, you're coming into that IP space. And I was at New York Comic Con and had a chat with Ethan Sachs, who worked on the Galaxy's Edge comic.
Yeah.
And who drew it. So, and the question to those guys was, given that Ethan's doing bounty hunters and he can take that story in crazy places because it is one of those kind of comics, how was it working within what was then physically Galaxy's Edge wasn't completed? It was sketched out quite detailed, but nothing was fully defined. And there are the barriers to what you can do with that storyline at that point. So you're working within quite a specific space. And I'm assuming Crash of Fate, you were working within quite a specific space. And I guess at a similar time, really. How was that for you?
It was actually super unbelievably cool. I got to go to Galaxy's Edge with Ethan and Will and Delilah Dawson. And so Disney Lucasfilm, they sent the four of us over there to sort of represent the book and comic initiative. And so Delilah obviously wrote the adult book. I wrote the YA. Will and Ethan did the comics. And so the four of us just got to play around Disney and do interviews for like 5 days. And it was absolutely, it was my first time in Disney World. I can't go back because I had the best experience. I won't be able to replicate it. And so it was really interesting because we were all seeing it at the same. I think Delilah got to go because she lives somewhere in Florida. And so she got to go while they were still constructing it. Nice. But the rest of us only saw it as a secret 180-page non-searchable PDF scanned that had your name on it, a timestamp every time you logged on.
Wow.
And so I constructed my story in a way where I wanted my characters to guide you through Galaxy's Edge. Like that was really important to me because I felt like this is my task. I'm writing a tie-in. I want to be able to show all of the places that are in the park so that if you read it and then you go to the park, you can recognize things. I have had a lot of readers over the years say, like, I read your book before I went to Galaxy's Edge and like I knew what to look for, or I knew where I wanted to go because I wanted to see like Savi's Workshop or Oga's Cantina. It felt interactive. I
remember when I read it back in the days, a few years ago, 3 years ago.
I think 2019.
Yeah, and reading through it, having not seen anything or knowing anything. And I thought, oh no, it's like an advert for the park. And then when I went to the park, I looked at the Ronto wraps and I looked at Savi's Workshop, and it just took me back to the book. So actually, it was a stroke of genius. Go back to High Republic with Convergence. What are your hopes for the book now? Now that it's on the verge of coming out, people are going to start reading it, reviewing it, and it's going to be out in the world. Well, first things first, will there be more from you during this phase of the High Republic?
This is my book for the High Republic. We'll see if I'm able to do other stuff in the future. But my hope is that people read this book and really get immersed into the politics of Aram and Arano. I spent so much time doing the world building for the two planets so that they feel unique and they feel like they have their own cultures. And that's my favorite part of writing fantasy is creating these settings. I only want the best for our Star Wars readers. And so I write with Star Wars readers in mind, which can sometimes feel a little daunting, but we're all fans. And so I just want everybody to enjoy themselves and meet some new characters, possible faves or possible characters that they don't like, or, we're all, we're all in it together.
That's true. Well, Celebration's coming up next year. So fingers crossed we might see some of your characters represented by cosplayers, which is always fun.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of Canon Fodder. For more Star Wars podcast content, be sure to subscribe to Fantha Tracks Radio on your podcatcher of choice. Subscribe to all our social media at links.fanthatracks.com. Be sure to be checking out fanthatracks.com daily for all your latest Star Wars news. And you can also join us live on YouTube for Good Morning Tatooine every Sunday evening at youtube.com/FanthaTracksTV.
Coming up next on Fantha Tracks Radio, it's Making Tracks.